When Christians compare God to love or art or any of these things, they could actually mean two very different things. One, that the existence of God is subject to subjectivity, and two, that the definition of God is uh, impossible or not very good. Um, Sometimes they say that it's actually impossible. About the missing definition or the impossible definition, um, couldn't disagree more. Uh, the definition of God is actually extremely simple. God is absolute. God is the absolute. That is the simplest, most concise definition of God that you can have. God is, by definition, outside of the universe or the creator of the universe, and as such, necessarily absolute. God, if God exists, then God has to be the first cause. So God is absolute. Let's go with that. Let's go with God's existence is subjective, and therefore we cannot debate about it, which I think most of the time is the consequence that Christian apologists intend when they say God is like love. Okay, so what does the term subjective mean? Rather quickly, subjective is obviously the opposite of objective. What is objective statement? Is a statement about something that can be tested independent of the person by any number of persons at any number of times. If enough people have tested it and experienced the statement in question to be true, then we say it's objectively true. Wikipedia actually defines subjectivity as an interpretation of experiences unique to the person experiencing them. I agree with that. I think we can go with that. It's a good question whether the two main examples that are always brought up in discussions, love and beauty, actually measure up to that definition of subjectivity. Love is the example of something that cannot be defined and that is totally subjective. I think love is a composite of attitudes and behaviors and emotions. Quite a lot of behaviors can actually be judged pretty much independent of a person as being an act of love or not being an act of love. I think you know what I'm aiming at. It is there are certain types of behaviors that are pretty obvious as acts of love or acts of non-love. Many acts of love are pretty much biologically determined. Bringing up your children is a good example. Um, Not everything is biologically determined. That is because we are humans and we are partially beyond biology. How about beauty? Of course, beauty standards are very much depending on your culture. Like in the time of Rubens, they favored big women. Now we favor pin-ups where you can use the actual model as a pin to pin up the pin-up, pardon the pinny pun. Um, but there are certain invariants, like for example, and this is interesting, um, the image of a beautiful landscape with a little river and a little forest and maybe rolling green hills in the background, lots of green, of flowers and grass and maybe animals is pretty much universally seen as beautiful. And it might have to do with the fact that this is a landscape that is supportive to human life. Just an idea. So even beauty is not altogether that subjective. However, nobody will argue, I hope, that I hope this is an objective fact, that there is a huge element of subjectivity to both love and beauty, namely uh, your personal, emotional, intellectual responses to stuff. You, over your life, you just build up a set of experiences, and these experiences inform your views on what is beautiful and what is not, and what you love and what you hate. Okay, but we can actually have discussions and agree or disagree on whether a painting, a photograph is beautiful. So the comparison doesn't seem to fit all that well. If we suppose that what is actually meant is the idea that God's existence is subjective, can it be partially subjective and partially objective? I highly doubt that, for the following reason. I think that the assertion that God's existence is a subjective point uh, just doesn't work, for the following reason. Is it possible that two people differ on this question? That one believes God exists and one does not believe God exists, and none of them are wrong and both of them are right. I think this is absurd because of the definition of God. God is absolute. If God is absolute, then either God is or God is not, but God cannot be there for one person and not be there for the next person. Um, because if that were the case, then God's existence would depend on the person, subjectively. So God's existence would depend on something, and by definition, God is absolute. Therefore, God's existence cannot depend on anything. So God cannot be subjective. I think, in conclusion, in many cases, people just use uh, this subjectivity issue to stop a discussion, to stop a debate, to say, hey, you're okay, I'm okay, it's all fancy, it's all okay, wonderful, it's all subjective, stuff like that. Um, I was one of those people at a time. By now, I've come to totally disagree with that notion because it stops the communication. If God were subjective, then you couldn't discuss anything about that. The discussions of faith wouldn't make any sense. Um, that would make me pretty sad. I would really not like that at all. But of course, if I were convinced that it is the case that God's existence is subjective, then, well, so be it. But as I said, it's not. Goodbye.